spend some time to explain my doctoral research, and this doctoral research is called The Effects of Hong Kong Employees' Workplace Stress on Heart Rate Variability. So this is Dr. Adrian Low, and the problem that everybody knows what stress is, and at the same time nobody knows what stress is. And this wasn't said by me. It's described by Hans Sale in 1978 from the evolution of stress concept. And also the newspaper from Hong Kong also mentioned that a typical Hong Kong employee is overworked, overstressed, and overwhelmed. And historically, there is actually no objective measurements of workplace stress. In other words, most of the research on workplace stress measurements has been done without accuracy and effectiveness. And the Penny George Institute of Health and Healing also mentioned that even with all the advancements in medicine, as clinicians, we don't have a good tool to measure and compare people's stress. So, if there is no proper objective measurements of stress or workplace stress, and particularly workplace stress, it will drastically contribute to over 300 billion US dollars in productivity losses, absenteeism, turnovers, medical, legal, and insurance costs. And physiologically, it will also increase in cardiovascular diseases, depression, and injury. So, having said that, my research was to introduce a new practical assessment known as the heart rate variability to objectively assess employee stress in the workplace. And I want to thank HeartMath to be providing the assessment tools known as the EMWave Pro. And I correlate the HRV quantitative measurements with with two self-reported stress scales. So one is the personal and organizational quality assessment known as the POCA, and the other is the perceived stress scales. And in the research, I adopted a quantitative research design which quantify the relationships between the variables. So on one hand, we have the dependent variables that's derived from the self-reported questionnaires from the perceived stress scale and the POCA. And on the other hand, we have the HRV measurements. And you can see we have different measurements here, the IBI, SDNN, RMSSD. These are really technical terms, and to simply put that, you just basically think of these terms as different ways to quantify HRV. So we're trying to resolve 4 research questions here. So one of which is, in what way can HRV be used to accurately measure long-term effects of workplace stress in Hong Kong? What are the effects of workplace stress in Hong Kong on HRV? And in what way does HRV compare with self-reports of stress in Hong Kong? And what is the overall level of comfort a typical Hong Kong employee experiences? And with that, I also did a intensive literature review, and here's what we found. Historically, there are historically there are three kinds of stress. One is the stimulus-based, response-based, and the transaction-based. Now the stimulus-based would think of stress as having mostly the triggering factors. And it's the triggering factors which is the most important elements, and they would argue that you just got to remove the stimulus and all the stress will be gone. However, the response base would argue that it's not the stimulus that's so important, but it's how a person or the body responds to the stimulus that's causing all the other issues, which could be psychological issues, physiological issues, or behavioral issues. Now the transaction based would argue the stimulus and response based as treating human beings as machines. And it's not that the stress that's so important, but it's how a person, let me rephrase that. It's not that the stimulus or the response of the stimulus that's so important, but it's how a person perceives the stress that's most important. Because two persons could perceive the same event differently. Anyway, we have to thank some of the psychologists from the response-based model that contributed to the modern psychophysiological theories of stress. And one of them is called the CATS model, Cognitive Activation Theory. And the CATS model basically defines a person having stress, having constant ruminations in his mind. And the mind is most of the time trying to solve problems, and which includes intense worry. So it could be rumination about work or non-work, and that inhibits the mind to have a calm state. And this person might have difficulty falling asleep and always staying asleep. Difficulty falling asleep and staying asleep, and having difficulty perceiving an acceptable level of sleep. So the CATS model would propose the solution of reducing the amount of mental activity in the mind. On the other hand, we have the allostatic load theory of stress, which talks about how the body tries its best to coordinate the internal functions and bring the body back to homeostasis. And having said that, there is something known as the allostatic load index, and we have to give credit to Mouse and L, and they designed a allostatic load index as a composite of 5 variables. So these are the 5 variables, and you can see that one of the interesting variable is heart rate variability, which makes heart rate variability as a convincing objective measurement of stress. And the third modern theory of stress is known as the resilience theory of stress. And resilience can be defined as the ability of a person to reinvigorate beyond his or her workplace situations. So a person who has a high resilience would be able to keep his or her internal resources intact within normal ranges. And this person can also maintain a appropriate level of allostatic load. So the resilience theory of stress would propose having perhaps mindfulness and resilience strategies. Now, we also have the emotional nature of stress, which argue that the primary source of stress is actually from the emotions, and that emotions that are triggered are more vulnerable than the cognitive perceptions themselves. And one of the prominent concept within the emotional nature of stress is the amygdala that's in our brain, which constantly trying to match and mismatch the different situations that a person is experiencing. And it's the familiarity of the person which the amygdala will try to make intrinsic and extrinsic adjustments to allow the body to have a match with the familiarity of the environment that the body has experienced from the past. And these intrinsic and extrinsic adjustments would possibly hamper the autonomic nervous systems and the HPA axis. So having these modern perspectives in mind, we can try to have a look at the workplace stresses from a workplace content or context which impact the organizational outcome or extra organizational outcome, which may cause biological deterministic problems as the symptoms, physical and mental health issues, burnout, high turnover, job strain, and job performance. So let's have a look at the research. So what I've done is I've conducted the research to actually 87 full-time employees, and 2 of the data has been unacceptable. So we have 85 full-time employees working at least 40 hours per week in a large corporations of over 500 employees. And here are the findings. So you can think of HRV as a overall index of health. The higher the HRV, the better. You can see if an employee perceives less stress, his or her overall health is better, which makes sense, isn't it? And we also have the older the employee, the HRV goes down, which is in alignment to the literature that we find. And when a relation tension goes down within the employment environments, the employee's overall health is better. However, there are some surprising findings, and here's one of them. Emotional stress goes up, HRV goes up as well. So it seems to be counterintuitive that an emotionally stressed employee is healthier. There are 4 ways to interpret this. So one of which is personality, and according to the Big 5, if an employee scores high in the conscientious scale, he or she would possibly be able to adapt better when he or she is experiencing emotional stress. So that's the interpretations of from the personality perspective. And it could also be because of the Asian culture, because in Asia, the Asians tend to mask their negative emotions. So the fact that the subjects are indicating that they are experiencing emotional stress, they are precisely the ones who are trying to regulate their emotional stress. While unhealthy employees, they suppress their emotional stress. Another interpretation could be the age factors, because the research participants from this research, they are considered the young populations group. Their age is around 21 to 40. So they may still be physiologically resilient, and the autonomic nervous systems may not wear and tear until possibly a later time. And here's another surprising finding. Healthier people have the intention to quit their jobs. And having said that, it seems like the healthy employees are the ones who are aware of their health situations, and they would try to change working environments in order to stay healthy. While the unhealthy ones, they may be tranquilized by the unhealthy work environments. And according to the polyvagal theory, if an employee is in a situation that's somewhat like a life-threatening situation, the employee may be unable to utilize mobilization strategies. And Steve Porch would coin this as the employee having immobilized with or without fear. So I think this, I hope it doesn't seem that I advocate people to quit their jobs, but it's a warning light to the higher management. And it's the environment of the working situations that either keep or lose out good employees and healthy employees. And it might be retaining the unhealthy ones. So having said that, it's so important to have an workplace environment that's emotionally stress-free, lesser or no relational tensions. So I think these are some of the elements that higher management should be aware of. So this research shows promising results, and I think future studies can continue to tap on HRV as an objective measurement of mental health and workplace stress. And for those who are considering doing their PhDs or doctoral research, maybe you can consider doing a similar research in other Asian countries like Singapore, Taiwan, and with a more diversified age group. And you could possibly repeat this research with other subjective perceived stress surveys and to confirm the results. Also, you may also consider performing comparative studies on heart-brain and face-heart connections, which can further explore and add to the body of knowledge regarding relational tension and resilience. And I think HRV measurements can also be used to evaluate the effectiveness of stress management interventions like mindfulness strategies or mental health programs. And having said that, we should also implement more intervention strategies like mindfulness psychology and integrative health coaching programs into corporations and the mental health industry. So this is my research. Thank you.